On what was supposed to be a peaceful flight, an elderly woman's life was put in danger when her essential medicine was thrown away by a flight attendant. But little did the crew know, the woman's daughter was not just a passenger. She was one of the most powerful CEOs in the country. Before the wheels even touched the ground, she'd bring the entire airline to its knees. The hum of the engines was a steady backdrop as passengers filed into the aircraft, stowing luggage, adjusting their seats, and settling in for what was expected to be an uneventful cross-country trip. The cabin was bright, the scent of fresh coffee lingering faintly in the air. Near the front, an elderly woman lowered herself carefully into her seat, her movements slow and deliberate. Her hands clutched a small fabric pouch, the way one might hold on to something irreplaceable. Inside were neatly labeled prescription bottles. Medicine she needed to take mid-flight to manage a condition that had been with her for years. Beside her daughter adjusted a blanket across her lap, speaking softly, offering small reassurances without drawing attention. They were quiet, unobtrusive passengers, content to mind their own business and let the journey pass in peace. A flight attendant moved down the aisle with a brisk, almost military pace. Her smile didn't quite reach her eyes, and when she stopped beside the elderly woman's row, her tone carried the sharp edge of authority. She gestured toward the pouch in the woman's lap, saying it would need to be stored away for safety reasons. The elderly woman looked up, a touch of confusion in her eyes, and explained that it contained her medication. Medicine she needed to take before landing, possibly even during the flight. She spoke gently, hoping reason would be enough. But the attendant's expression didn't soften. She leaned slightly closer, voice clipped, said it was just a pill and could wait until they landed. The daughter turned her head, listening. Now, watching the exchange, she saw her mother try once more to explain, her voice tinged with the urgency of someone who knew her own body well enough to understand the risks. But the attendant's body language spoke volumes. Folded arms, impatient sigh, the kind of look that suggested this was a nuisance rather than a need. Without warning, she reached out, plucked the pouch from the elderly woman's hands, and straightened up. The motion was swift and final, like closing a door. She didn't wait for a protest before walking away, her steps sharp against the cabin floor. The daughter felt a flash of heat rise in her chest. She had seen her mother handle difficult moments with grace for as long as she could remember, but this was different. This was not misunderstanding, it was dismissal. Still, she took a slow breath and told herself not to react, at least not yet. Her priority was keeping her mother calm. She shifted in her seat, placing a reassuring hand on her mother's arm, and tried to focus on the steady rumble of the engines rather than the quickening of her own heartbeat. From the corner of her eye, she saw the flight attendant near the galley at the front of the plane, leaning toward another crew member. A muffled laugh carried back through the cabin, followed by a phrase just loud enough to catch. Some passengers are so overdramatic. The daughter's jaw tightened. She looked at her mother, whose shoulders had slumped slightly, her face pale beneath the warm overhead lights. The color seemed to be draining from her skin, and her breathing had taken on a faint, uneven rhythm. The daughter's mind began counting time without even meaning to. 2 hours. That was all her mother had before the misdose could lead to dizziness, confusion, and worse. She knew the effects. She'd seen them before when a flight delay had forced her mother to miss her schedule by even an hour. The thought of being thousands of feet in the air, far from proper medical help, made her stomach twist. She wanted to believe the situation could be resolved quickly, but the smug tone she'd overheard told her this wasn't going to be easy. Around them, other passengers were oblivious, flipping through magazines, scrolling on phones, or chatting quietly with their seatmates. The air carried that peculiar mix of anticipation and resignation that always came before takeoff. But for the daughter, the mood had already shifted. Every minute felt heavier, as though the plane itself had tilted slightly into unfamiliar territory. She watched her mother close her eyes briefly, perhaps to rest, perhaps to keep from showing how unsettled she was. The seatbelt sign chimed on, a mechanical voice reminding passengers to prepare for departure. The daughter glanced toward the front again. The flight attendant was still there, still in control of the pouch that should never have left her mother's hands. She thought of speaking up, of calling the attendant back before the doors closed, but she held herself back. There would be a right moment, and when it came, she would make certain her voice carried farther than a single row. For now, she focused on her mother, adjusting the blanket again. Even though it didn't need adjusting, just to give her hand something to do besides clench into fists. The engines roared. The cabin shuddered lightly, and the plane began its slow crawl toward the runway. Outside the small oval window, the world slid past in shades of gray and silver. Inside, time felt sharper, every second marking the quiet race between necessity and neglect. Somewhere at the front of the aircraft, her mother's medicine was out of reach, and the daughter knew they were already one step closer to the moment where calm would no longer be an option. The seatbelt sign had barely turned off when the daughter pressed the call button, her movements measured but purposeful. A soft chime rang out, and within moments the flight attendant appeared, the same one who had taken the pouch. The daughter spoke calmly at first, her voice low but steady, explaining that her mother's medication was urgently needed, that she could not wait until the end of the flight. She didn't demand, she didn't accuse, she simply laid out the facts. But instead of understanding, the attendant rolled her eyes in open dismissal, letting the silence stretch before finally saying the medicine had already been disposed of. She added with a shrug that felt almost taunting that loose pills aren't allowed on board, ignoring the truth that they had been in clearly labeled prescription bottles. The daughter felt the words land like cold steel. This wasn't a matter of policy gone wrong. It was a choice, one dripping with arrogance. Her mother shifted uncomfortably beside her, the tremor in her hands becoming more noticeable. The color in her cheeks had faded further, her lips pressing together in an effort to hide the discomfort. The daughter's mind spun, calculating the minutes they'd been airborne and how quickly the clock was ticking toward danger. She pressed the call button again, this time holding it until the light above her seat blinked insistently. The attendant returned, her smile tighter now, her tone clipped. The daughter asked to speak to the supervising crew member, and after a pause filled with silent defiance, the attendant walked away. When the supervisor arrived, he carried himself like a man who had already chosen a side. His voice was smooth, but his words were laced with condescension. He repeated the line about safety regulations and assured her the situation was under control, without once asking what the medication was for or why it was needed. It was clear he hadn't checked any facts. He didn't even ask the location of the medication now that it had been taken. He simply backed the flight attendant, as if their word alone was the final authority. The daughter felt something shift. Inside her, that point where patience and diplomacy start to fracture under the weight of neglect around them. The quiet stir of attention began to spread. Passengers in nearby rows leaned subtly into the aisle, some glancing at the elderly woman's pale face, others stealing looks at the daughter's expression. The low hum of whispering filled the air like a current. A few passengers reached for their phones. The faint click of cameras and the soft red glow of recording lights signaling that this was no longer a private matter. The daughter glanced at her mother, who now sat rigid, a faint tremor running through her body. Her breathing had become shallow, uneven, each inhale a little slower than the last. The daughter's decision was immediate. She asked loudly enough for several rows to hear if there was a doctor on board. A brief pause followed. Then a man rose from a seat, several rows back, and made his way forward, his carry-on medical kit slung over one shoulder. He introduced himself to the supervisor, then knelt beside the elderly woman, taking her wrist in, his hand to check her pulse. The examination was quick, and his verdict was firm. He looked directly at the supervisor and said the woman's condition was worsening, that without the correct medication, there was a serious risk of her collapsing mid-flight. His words cut through the murmurs like a blade, but the crew didn't spring into action. Instead, hesitation hung thick in the air, the kind born from disbelief and a quiet gamble. Maybe this passenger was exaggerating. That was the moment the daughter's voice changed. Gone was the careful politeness, replaced by a measured authority that left no room for misunderstanding. She informed the crew that this was now a medical emergency, and that standard in-flight emergency protocol was to be initiated immediately. Her eyes locked on the supervisor, unblinking, and for a heartbeat the space between them seemed to harden. Still, he hesitated, glancing toward the flight attendant, as if seeking silent approval. They didn't believe her. They thought this was desperation talking, an emotional bluff from someone without real leverage. But the daughter didn't argue. She reached into her bag, drew out her phone, and began dialing. Not friends, not family. Her voice remained calm as she spoke, but each word carried the weight of certainty. She identified herself quietly, gave the flight number, the current coordinates, and reported a violation directly to aviation authorities. The effect was instant. Even without knowing the exact details of the conversation, those nearby could feel the shift in the air, the awareness that this woman was not powerless, that the clock was no longer the crew's to control. The daughter ended the first call without raising her voice. Her phone still in her hand as she navigated to a secure line only a handful of people in the world had access to. Her tone was quiet, deliberate, every syllable precise as she spoke to her corporate security team. She relayed the situation with no embellishment, providing the flight number, current airspeed, altitude, and the exact nature of the medical and procedural violation. There was no request in her words-only instructions, delivered as someone accustomed to decisions being carried out without delay. Within moments of her hanging up, the shift began, invisible at first to most passengers, but unmistakable too. The trained eye. The cockpit door opened briefly as the captain stepped out to speak with the supervising crew member, his expression tight, his voice low. A whisper passed between them, and then the captain disappeared back inside. Less than 5 minutes later, the intercom crackled on, but it wasn't the usual cheerful announcement. The captain's voice was formal, almost clipped, and when he addressed the crew, it was clear this wasn't part of the script. Orders had come down from airline headquarters direct, orders requiring immediate protocol adjustments. In the galley, one of the attendants froze mid-step, the color draining from her face. Another glanced toward the daughter's row with a flicker of unease, recognition dawning. It didn't take long for the truth to settle among them. This passenger was no ordinary traveler. This was someone with reach that extended into the walls of the very building where their employment contracts were signed. Someone whose influence didn't just brush the edges of the airline, it sat deep in its foundation. The atmosphere in the cabin shifted as if a current had swept through. Conversations hushed. The subtle click of phone cameras grew more frequent, and eyes began turning toward the front of the plane where the elderly woman sat, her daughter beside her, composed and still. Passengers who had been unaware moments before now sensed the gravity of what was unfolding. There was a certain collective pause in the air, the recognition that they were witnessing something rare, the moment when the balance of authority on an aircraft quietly, decisively tipped. The daughter rose slightly from her seat, just enough to speak directly to the captain when he emerged again. Her words carried easily in the silence that had settled across the nearby rows. She instructed him, without hesitation, to prepare for an unscheduled landing at the nearest major airport. There was no discussion of inconvenience, no debate over the schedule. The order was given as fact, and the captain gave a single nod before returning to the cockpit. Around her, passengers exchanged glances, some murmuring their support, others simply watching in fascination as events unfolded with a precision that felt almost cinematic. In the meantime, one of the attendants appeared with a small plastic case, the onboard emergency medical kit. Inside were basic supplies, pain relievers, bandages, saline, and oxygen. They did what they could for the elderly woman, offering her a blanket and helping her take small sips of water. But the daughter knew it was a temporary measure, a thin shield against the reality that the medication had been destroyed, leaving her mother vulnerable. She thanked the attending crew member without warmth, the words polite but cool, her attention fixed entirely on her mother's comfort. When the supervisor approached again, his tone was no longer condescending but measured, his posture less rigid. The daughter turned to face him fully, her expression unreadable. She informed him in an even voice that when the plane landed, every crew member involved in the incident would remain on board until aviation compliance officers could conduct a full investigation. No one, she emphasized, would leave the aircraft. The statement hung in the air, final and immovable. And though the supervisor opened his mouth as if to object, he closed it again almost immediately. The authority in her voice left no room for argument. The murmurs in the cabin grew louder, the whispers threading from row to row. Words like lawsuit, owner, and headquarters passed between passengers. Some continued to film discreetly, others openly, knowing that whatever was happening would not be easily forgotten. The elderly woman rested her head back against the seat, her breathing steadying slightly under the care she was receiving, but the strain was still visible in her features. Her daughter remained beside her, a steady presence, her phone in hand, but her focus locked on every movement. Of the crew, even those who had tried to ignore the unfolding scene could feel the weight in the air now. It was in the straightened backs of the attendants, in the tightened voices over the intercom, in the way the captain's updates were given with an edge of urgency. The usual power dynamic of the flight crew holding authority, passengers following. Instruction had shifted entirely. Here in the sealed cabin, thousands of feet above the ground, authority had been overtaken, not with volume or threats, but with a calm certainty backed by an invisible network of power. The realization settled over the plane like an unspoken truth. The crew was no longer in control. The descent began with none of the usual calm. Passengers felt the steady, purposeful drop in altitude, the subtle change in the engine's tone, and the quiet focus in the captain's voice as he announced the diversion. Outside the windows, the ground drew closer, city lights and roads coming into sharper view. When the wheels touched the runway, there was no applause. No chatter, only the sound of the engines reversing and the faint metallic groan of the landing gear. As the plane slowed, it became clear this was no ordinary arrival. Instead of the familiar sight of a gate crew waiting with baggage carts, the runway ahead was lined with flashing lights. Emergency medical teams stood ready beside ambulances. Security vehicles idled with their doors open. And several black cars marked with aviation compliance insignia were positioned like sentinels. The door opened quickly, but there was no rush. To disembark, medical personnel boarded first, moving directly to the elderly woman's seat with quiet urgency. Her daughter stepped aside just enough to let them work, her presence still protective but not obstructing. They checked vitals, spoke to her gently, and prepared her for transfer. Within minutes, she was on her way down the narrow aisle, escorted onto the tarmac toward one of the waiting ambulances. Her daughter walking close behind until she was certain her mother was safely inside. Back on board, the atmosphere tightened again. The crew, who might normally be moving about to prepare for the next boarding, were instead instructed over the intercom to remain seated. 2 compliance officers entered, their manner calm but unmistakably authoritative. They began questioning the crew members one by one, noting down accounts, their pens moving steadily over official forms. Passengers were asked to remain in their seats for the time being, but many raised their hands to volunteer statements. Several pulled out their phones, showing video clips that captured both the initial confrontation and the dismissive laughter. In the galley afterward, evidence was clear, the voices on the recordings leaving little room for interpretation. The daughter returned to the aircraft after ensuring her mother's care, moving with a calm purpose that drew the eyes of more. Then a few passengers. Near the front, 2 senior airline executives waited, their suits crisp despite the late hour, their expressions serious. She spoke to them quietly, her voice low but firm. Whatever she said was met with nods that carried the weight of agreement rather than negotiation. The conversation lasted only minutes before the executives turned to the compliance officers, relaying instructions that were followed without hesitation. By the time the crew was released from their seats, it was not to resume their duties, but to be escorted away by company officials for immediate suspension pending investigation. There was no ceremony to it, no raised voices, just the silent acknowledgement that their roles on this flight had ended. The passengers, many of whom had been watching intently, exchanged glances that ranged from satisfaction to disbelief. The shift from powerless observation to witnessing justice in action had been swift, and it left a mark. Arrangements were made for every passenger before they even stepped off the plane. Representatives from the airline walked the aisles distributing vouchers, and confirming alternative travel plans. The daughter had ensured that not only would the inconvenience be addressed, but that each person on board would leave knowing they had been seen, their time respected. It was not just about courtesy, it was about principle. Later, in the quiet of a private airport lounge, she sat beside her mother, who now rested more comfortably after receiving the proper medication. The noise of the terminal was far away here, placed by the soft hum of air conditioning and the muted clink of glasses from a nearby refreshment table. She leaned toward her mother, her voice warm and certain, promising that this would never happen again. Not to her, not to anyone she could protect. Her mother smiled faintly, the tension in her shoulders easing for the first time since they had boarded the flight hours earlier. Days later, the story broke across news outlets. The airline issued a public statement, the words carefully chosen but unflinching in their admission of fault. The staff involved were confirmed to have been terminated, and a comprehensive review of procedures was announced. New training programs focused on passenger rights and medical necessity were to be implemented immediately. The footage taken by passengers on that flight circulated widely, a sharp reminder that arrogance and neglect could find themselves under the brightest light when least expected. And somewhere, away from the headlines and the noise, a mother and daughter continued their journey together, carrying with them the quiet knowledge that the sky itself had once stood still to deliver justice.